So I'm actually so delighted to be the moderator today because often I get to moderate panels where I have the pressure of being some kind of supposed expert on the topic and have to contribute. I know nothing about this topic, so I am here to learn as much as anyone, probably more than anyone in this room. And luckily, we have three unbelievable experts with us. And so we are quite honestly going to jump right in. I'm just going to see for a time check. Sorry, you need to be using the mic. Do it, okay. All right. Nobody ever tells me I'm too quiet, but apparently this is some kind of technical feature. Can I just ask about a time check? Will I be able to see something?
Yes,
okay.
You'll be able to see that as soon as it starts working.
Perfect. Okay. And so I've got with me, and I feel like these folks need no introduction, but I'm just going to give you their names and titles. Christine Boyle, City Councillor, City of Vancouver. Dr. Melissa Lem, President, Canadian Association of Physicians for the Environment. And Christopher Tanov, Centre for the Study of Democratic Institutions at UBC. And I'm not going to give you their bios, but I'm going to hope that they're going to weave some of it in, because if I did their bios, that would take our whole 40 minutes together, because they're kind of an accomplished set of folks. So I'm going to start with Christine and ask, what in your background brings you to the topic of sustainability and health, the intersection?
Thanks so much. An absolute joy to join you all. And I want to say thank you to the organizers for adapting and letting us join this way. I am stuck at home in my bedroom, isolating from COVID. So I'm still delighted that I get to join you and this incredible panel on the unceded territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh to talk about a topic that I love and could talk about forever. I come from a healthcare family. Both of my parents, many of my aunts, my sister all work in healthcare in various ways. I didn't formally take that path, but I have found in many of the paths that my career has taken connections back to healthcare. So I got involved in climate advocacy, climate activism in my 20s. One of the big moments for me was reading about witnessing Hurricane Katrina. Something about that particular event landed for me more firmly than others. The significant human toll that climate change was beginning to have and was going to continue to have, and as well the fact that that toll was very likely going to be very inequitable, that the folks hit hardest were the folks already struggling the most in a variety of ways. And I had been involved in work around poverty reduction and Indigenous rights already, and got pulled into climate change for those reasons. And it's continued to be a focus for me. Like Christie said, I won't go through my whole bio either, but I have worked, my career path has been winding, and I worked as a faith leader for a while. I was doing local and national multi-faith community organizing work around climate. I was elected for the first time to City Council in 2018. And the health impacts of climate, the inequitable impacts of climate, as well as the solutions that cross all of these lines continue to draw me in. And I have 2 kids now, and so that keeps me involved in health and climate work as well, thinking about what's at stake for them, and also thinking about what's possible in terms of the better lives that we could be leaving for future generations.
Thank you. Melissa, are you willing to give us a bit of line of sight into your background?
Absolutely. Thanks, Christie. If I think about how far back my work in sustainability and health goes, it probably would go back to childhood. So the reason being, I grew up in a majority white neighborhood in Toronto, and I found that when I was in green spaces, in parks, in my father's traditional Chinese garden, that's where I felt like I belonged, and that's where I felt safe from the racism, from the exclusion that we sometimes experience being, a racialized family in a majority white neighborhood. And then fast forward to my own kind of crisis nature deficit, I started my career as a full service rural family doctor in northern BC, and it was an objectively difficult job as a fresh doctor in my mid-20s. But even though I was running the emergency department, delivering babies at all hours of the night, and managing sick inpatients like by myself with only family doctors and no specialist backup, I still loved the job and was energized by it. And then after a year or two, moved back to Toronto for family reasons, and then suddenly felt myself not as energized, feeling edgy, even though the work, outpatient student medicine, was objectively easier. And it was at that point that I discovered this evidence base behind the health benefits of nature that I'd never heard before. This was close to 15 years ago. And I thought at that time, I've never learned about this. I don't hear anyone talking about this. I need to make sure this gets in front of decision makers and the public and my colleagues. So I started working and speaking and advocating in the nature and health field. But it was only when after, it's kind of similar to Christine, I guess, after I had my my son, after I realized what was at stake for my child. I remember he was 3 months old, and I was actually kind of actively trying to avoid the climate change space because it felt scary, and nature and health is a really friendly, kind of non-controversial space. But I started reading Naomi Klein's This Changes Everything, which is a book about climate change and capitalism and how capitalism is driving it. And it opened my eyes to climate change and the effects that would happen if we didn't start acting on it now at the speed and scale that we required. And so it was at that point, close to 9 years ago, that I started on my climate journey and my sustainability journey. And so now I'm president of the Canadian Association of Physicians for the Environment. Really kind of worked my way up through after connecting with the BC Committee of CAPE, and also Director of Park Prescriptions for the BC Parks Foundation. So I find it a really great way to kind of marry all of the interests I have and move sustainability forward at the same time. Thanks.
Okay, honestly, that's is super inspiring. Chris, do you want to share a bit of how you come to this conversation?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for having me, and thanks to Christie for having to manage a Chris and a Christine on a single panel. There's a lot to juggle there. So I am a researcher, and I help run the Center for the Study of Democratic Institutions. And I come at this less as someone who's actively engaged in health or environmental policy, and more engaged on the issue of how do we have political communication and democratic action on issues like this. And so in recent years, I've been doing research on a couple things that often intersect with climate and health policy. And that has to do with global mis and disinformation and the issue in Canada. And also we've been doing research on the toxic, hostile, sometimes threatening online messaging that people in public life encounter. And again, particularly when they're outspoken on these hot button issues. And sometimes this is about the issues, and sometimes there are aspects of misogyny or racism or anti-Semitism that get brought into these sorts of conversations. And so, you know, fundamental to my thinking about this is that we need to have good democratic conversations in order to mobilize and deal with big shared issues. And that quite often doesn't happen. And when I was thinking about this panel, I was reflecting on a report that a team of the students did in the spring for the city of Vancouver as their client. And it was around this issue of climate misinformation and how the city of Vancouver might address that. And students, I'll put the link into Slido shortly so that anyone who's interested can get a look at it. But among the recommendations they had, they also gave an example of, you know, that really illustrates some of the dynamics at stake here. And that has to do with this pretty benign, positive policy, municipal policy proposal, which is to make cities more livable and to reduce car dependence by emphasizing the possibility of being able to access all your key services within 15 minutes of wherever you live. So that was called the 15-minute city plan. And it was being pushed by a few different cities, most prominently a few years ago in Paris, but more recently it had come to places like Edmonton and Essex County in Ontario and a few other places. And in some of these cases, you had this kind of counter mobilization against this policy, with people thinking this is plot in order to confine us to these zones of cities, to reduce our freedom of movement so we can't travel or we can't go by car across these district lines without being surveilled, and so on, and feeding into this real distrust and cynicism about what government can do to help address some of these big issues. And part of the reason this is happening is because we have a very fertile online environment for this kind of polarizing and sometimes fact-free campaigns and problems. But also we have, media elites and influencers who jump in and really amplify these things. And so that's just, I think, a problem we really need to grapple with as we're dealing with big collective issues.
Okay, that's fantastic, because thank you, Chris. You've kind of jumped in on my question. My next question, before I even started, you touched on it. So the description today, part of it asked, how do we tackle these problems in and hopefully this was pun intended, polluted digital media environment? And so I'm going to ask, maybe I can, Melissa, ask you, given this context, so Chris has mentioned disinformation in decision making, how do we have better conversations about this topic?
Christie, I'm going to make 2 points. And the first point is that I think we have to know our audience. So the traditional ways that we've tried to communicate our messages that are evidence-based and equitable and well-considered aren't really landing the same way, because newer generations aren't consuming media and messages the same way that they used to. So I'm a member of the Canadian Medical Association's media network, and they actually commissioned a company to do some studies on Gen Z, so those people who are born after the mid-1990s, and how they consume information. And so some of the really interesting information, some of the points that came out were that 34% of them believe that the average person is as knowledgeable as a doctor when it comes to their health. They actually trust their friends and family about similar, if not more, than health experts and scientists. 74% of them are spending multiple hours on social media every day, and YouTube is actually the #1 platform where they consume health information, and Google actually is another place that they go versus an existing health professional. And so the problem is that a lot of kind of media and physician influencers, people who try to transmit evidence-based knowledge, they're not really on YouTube. They're not really on TikTok. A lot of them are on Twitter, where Gen Z actually only makes up about less than 10% of their audience. Another point about Gen Z is that those who want to consume, those who are kind of news avoiders, actually tend to gravitate towards news that's positive and solutions-based, whereas a lot of the news that's often put in our faces is awful news about how the healthcare system is collapsing, how the climate is collapsing. So I think we have to keep the needs of a new audience in mind and try to reach past the platforms that we have. But something else I think that we need to do is, in some ways, eliminate those bad actors from the conversation. So Cape actually has an active fossil fuel ad ban campaign going on right now. We have a parliamentary petition that was sponsored by MP John Aldag, who's right here in the Lower Mainland, that's petitioning the federal government to enact a ban on fossil fuel advertising. And that's, for many reasons, advertising drives demand for fossil fuels. And also they have engaged more recently in greenwashing, because most people now believe that climate change exists. For quite some time, their misinformation campaigns convinced a broad swath of the population that climate change wasn't real. But now that we have heat domes and floods and wildfires and smoke in our faces, it's hard to argue it doesn't exist. And so we've actually opened up. There are 3 active investigations that the Competition Bureau of Canada has opened into cases that CAPE has helped file against greenwashing by natural gas and oil sands and other fossil fuel companies. So I think it's important. So first of all, maybe go sign that petition and support our effort to try to get fossil fuel ads banned. There's precedent, for example, France and the Netherlands have both banned fossil fuel ads in some capacity. And then just, support CAPE's work and keep an eye out for the information that we put out when we're trying to get this misinformation away from people.
Super helpful. I'm learning things here. Christine, I feel like your world must bump up against this topic of misinformation and decision making. Do you have some thoughts to share?
Absolutely, and I also am a big fan of Kate's work around challenging greenwashing, and in particular the ban on fossil fuel advertising. I think it's really important, and there's a valuable comparison with the tobacco industry and the ban that happened and the challenge to the social license, and that comparison goes back further to when the tobacco industry was funding misinformation campaigns about the impacts that tobacco has on health. So a lot of important comparisons there that Cape and others are making clear. The student-led fossil fuel divestment movement similarly were drawing that comparison in pushing for divestment from fossil fuels. So the ad ban campaign, I think, is really important. It certainly gets me riled up when we're watching something on CBC Gem, which is maybe the only place I consume ads these days, and an ad for a big gas-guzzling SUV comes on. So grateful for that. I see a lot of misinformation at the municipal level, and it's a real challenge. The level of climate literacy not just in Vancouver, but in Vancouver is low, which is surprising because we are an area with a lot of strong commitment to green and environmental ideas. So the city of Vancouver has done polling over the years, and around 90% of residents respond that they support or strongly support their local government taking stronger action to address the climate emergency or address the climate crisis. I can't remember how the question was framed. And then when the follow-up question is asked about what that action would look like, people just aren't sure. A lot of answers that relate to recycling, people kind of understand that they should get out of their car a bit more. In part, that lack of clarity about the causes of climate change are, like Melissa said, because of confusion and misinformation sowed by bad faith actors in the fossil fuel industry. So we talk about natural gas, for instance. Natural gas is an incredibly misleading term for fracked methane gas, and in Vancouver, 56% of our carbon pollution comes from burning gas in buildings. So if we are going to take the urgent action that we need to tackle the climate emergency at a local level, it means getting new buildings off of gas and then working to get existing buildings off of gas. But people understandably don't think of that as our biggest source. And part of that goes back to intentional misinformation campaigns, including talking about burning gas as natural gas. That's not an accident that's the term that was socialized and continues to be used. And so I do see some of my work as naming where those largest sources of gas are, or largest sources of pollution are, the largest being gas, 56% in buildings, and then 40% of our carbon pollution comes from burning gas in transportation. So I repeat those numbers again and again because I think it's important that we know where our carbon pollution is coming from so that our solutions get right to the heart of that. And to Chris's point earlier, I certainly experience some pushback online sometimes, some pretty vile and aggressive opposition to just naming these climate realities and pushing for solutions. But I think cutting through that misinformation is incredibly important because I know I meet Vancouverites and beyond all of the time who want us to be doing more. And, people are busy living their whole lives and they don't I don't think everybody needs to be the expert on each of these pieces, but those of us in leadership positions need to be very clear about these numbers, about these sources of emissions, and then very clear in the solutions that we promote to address them.
Fantastic. And I feel like I've heard a statistic, you need to repeat something 14 times before the average person. So we've only got twice on the 56%. So everybody wait, maybe she needs to say it. Hopefully you wrote notes if you don't, going to hear it again 12 times. Okay, Chris, do you touched on this, but do you have more you can share based on your work?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of having good conversations, in some ways, we're in the best of times and the worst of times for these sorts of things, because there are these very accessible platforms and digital media spaces where you can get great information on almost anything. There are these opportunities for real exchanges, including with your elected representatives. That was much easier than it used to be. So that's the positive side. There's a lot of opportunity there. But to turn to the negative side here, I mean, there is a huge supply of toxic and false communication that's going to be out there, and that people are going to have to develop literacies and strategies to deal with it. But there are also these parts that cross the line and that are more threatening, are promoting harmful falsehoods. And so from a policy perspective, Canada and a lot of other governments are trying to grapple with this and find the right policies forward on it. And we've been waiting in Canada for a regulatory approach to social media platforms that can address some of these issues. And we continue to wait, but hopefully we'll see some soon from Parliament. And to go to this topic, both Christine and I have mentioned about the kind of the hostility and negativity that people face in messaging, on social media platforms when they're using them. Part of the issue, part of this response that has to be universities and political parties and journalism organizations and all these different types of institutions that employ frontline communicators need to build up their policies to better support individuals and to provide the kind of support that different types of individuals from different backgrounds and even with different dispositions might need. And that's something that at CSDI we're really working on, is trying to develop those kind of best practices so people aren't, when facing this kind of stuff, getting pushed out of a conversation that they should be part of. And I think another challenge is that the way that a lot of these platforms are designed, the most hostile or intense stuff kind of pops out in people's experiences or feeds. And there's a lot less engagement with, broader publics who might want to have conversations, or even you kind of see people getting pulled into more antagonistic communication than they might otherwise want. So, I mean, I think going forward, we really need to improve the sort of communication infrastructure that we're all using.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, just as a general member of the public, it is so disheartening. You see leaders from sort of all areas of public leadership that are clearly spreading information which is they must know not to be true, going unchecked. And then you have other leaders really bravely sharing real information to help people, and actually they're facing all kinds, not only, but a lot of women in politics, for example, facing unbelievable hostility and real threats to even their personal safety. So it's so nice. It's so great to hear all of you, talking about that. It's such an important topic. Can I ask, and maybe I'll start with Christine now. What are you seeing as some of the gaps or maybe future directions in the work at the intersection of sustainability and health?
Oh, such a good question. I am really buoyed by how many, particularly at the municipal level, how many of our climate solutions improve health and well-being for residents. So I talked about, here it is again, the biggest sources of pollution in Vancouver, and it's similar in most municipalities, are burning gas in buildings and burning gas in transportation. We know that we need to reduce both of those dramatically. What that looks like is getting our buildings off of gas, building new homes that are more climate resilient and don't burn gas, and retrofitting existing buildings. And folks in the room will remember as recently as this summer, but particularly the big heat dome we had a couple of years ago, people's homes became very dangerous places for them to be. And 100 people in Vancouver died from the heat dome, almost all in their own home, basically cooked alive in their own home. So the same work to get off gas and reduce emissions in our buildings is also going to make our buildings healthier and safer for people to live in. When we install heat pumps in buildings, heat pumps also provide cooling in the summer, and they use very little electricity. Those types of changes dramatically reduce the carbon pollution that a building creates, and they make it safer. And that's work that we need to do in single family homes. It's work that we need to be doing in large apartments and social housing buildings and more. And it's important that we do that work in a way that protects existing renters and tenants who are already being the most hard hit by extreme weather events, and particularly by heat. That's on the building side. On the transportation side, again, our climate solutions are also health and equity solutions. So when more people don't need to rely on a private gas vehicle, we have healthier communities. And I will say very clearly, I don't think that the climate solution in transportation is switching all of our gas vehicles over to electric vehicles. It needs to be much more than that. We need to make public transportation much more efficient, more reliable for people, so that choosing to take public transit makes more sense when you're entering your destination into Google, that the fastest route is the public transit route, so that more people choose it. Similarly, we need to make it a lot safer to take a bike or an electric scooter or to walk. There are lots of infrastructure investments that cities like Vancouver can and should be making to make it safer to get around. And increasingly, I've been seeing more and more families and seniors using electric bikes to get around. I think that's a game-changing solution in transportation. But at the city level, we need to make it safer. There are still a lot of people who could choose to take an electric bike, but they're nervous about one section of their trip that requires them to be in traffic or something like that. So that's an important piece that we, as a local government, alongside investments provincially and federally, can be making to help people choose to not rely on a private gas car. And it improves air quality, it improves human health. It means that people are seeing one another more than you do when you're driving alone in your own car. And there are really important social and health and community benefits to that kind of interaction. And the last pitch I will make is that land use is an important piece of this too. So where and how we build buildings is important. To Chris's point about 15-minute cities, it actually is an important local climate action that we build housing close to where people work, so that people can get to the regular stops in their life, their work, but also their kids' school and the grocery store and more, without needing to rely on a car. And that means building much more complete walkable neighborhoods where you're close to the things you need to get to.
Okay, thank you. Chris, can I ask you the same question, where you're seeing gaps, future directions in the work, the intersection of sustainability and health?
Yeah, I mean, focusing on the sustainability part, this isn't as big a source as heating buildings or transportation, but I think we do need to keep an eye on the digital tech sector and some of these sustainability issues. And we did see, with Bitcoin or crypto mining, just these operations using huge amounts of energy that perhaps could have been used in other ways. When other technologies existed that were possible for, you know, for doing what the mining was supposed to be doing. And we've got new regulatory approaches that were introduced to deal with energy usage in BC and other jurisdictions. So that's one that's come along, but you know, the industry moved a fair ways before regulators started to really look at it. And again, not as big as those mining operations, but even in the training and use of the AI models that are very much in the news right now, it's something we should keep an eye on. You know, there's a project I worked on just a couple years ago where we trained a large language model to help us analyze mean tweets at politicians. And I later learned it was, you know, depending on how the energy for the computational power was generated, could have used, you know, the same amount or had the same emissions as like a transcontinental flight. And you just don't think about it because it's virtual. You're just hitting a button to make it happen. It's way off there that there's a data center, you know, chugging away and then flushing off in huge amounts of water to keep it cool. And so I think, again, it's not a huge energy burden, but it's an important one. It's a couple percentage, I think, of global energy use and emissions that are around these kind of data centers and computational centers that we need to just making sure that we're keeping those as efficient as possible.
Yeah, that's super helpful. I feel like that's, you know, North America's deserts are being converted into these, you know, in these incredibly hot conditions, these, exactly as you said, and it's this invisible, you know, environmental impact. Okay, Melissa, from where you come to this work, the same question for you, where you're seeing gaps and or future directions in sustainability and health.
I want to underline what both Christine and Chris said. So number one, I fully recognize that only 20% of our health status, if for the average person in Canada, comes from our healthcare system. And 80% comes from the infrastructure around us, whether it be social or physical, and also our ecosystems being healthy. So to have active transportation infrastructure, to have public transportation, to have people in healthy homes that don't burn gas and pollute the indoor air, and have cooling systems, that's really, really important, arguably more than I can do in my office or within the healthcare system to help keep people healthy. But if we're going to look at where I think a gap is, other than all that infrastructure outside of the healthcare system, is within the healthcare system too. So the healthcare system in Canada contributes about 5% to our overall greenhouse gas emissions. And it doesn't sound like a lot, but it's actually the same as aviation. And you know how much we hear about how much we should be cutting down our flying. So, you know, we're trying to do no harm, but we're harming people at the same time by reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And so we have to think about how to decarbonize healthcare. And the truth is that, kind of similar to what Chris said, you know, when you click a button, when you're providing care to a patient, the vast majority of the emissions come from an upstream place, come from scope 3 emissions in the creation and transportation of the drugs and equipment and all that stuff to the buildings where we actually burn natural gas and, you know, reduce emissions at source. So we have to think about those upstream emissions. So if we want to actually decarbonize our healthcare system, which, by the way, Canada actually committed to 2 COPs ago. So 2 years ago, Canada signed on to the World Health Organization's Low Carbon and Sustainable Health Systems program to work on making our healthcare system more resilient and also reduce the carbon emissions. If we want to actually achieve that, instead of just, you know, signing a piece of paper, we have to work on decarbonizing our healthcare system. And then, you know, just a quick word, because I know we're running short on time, but just recognizing the importance of conservation and nature and green space access for our health. I think, you know, a lot of us know now about the effects that climate change have on our health, but less people talk about the effects of biodiversity on health. So I think more awareness about that, and then more action to help conserve and expand those green spaces to improve human well-being is really important.
Wow, I don't know how many people in the audience knew that our healthcare system, the urgency of the need to decarbonize it, and the fact that it is actually has the same carbon profile as aviation. That's new for me. Okay, thank you, Dr. Lam. Okay, I've got another question. So we've got a room full of folks that are either deeply interested in innovation or they're leaders in their fields related to innovation. Do you think you could connect some dots for us on sustainability and health and innovation? How do we get innovation in the progress that we need? And maybe let's see, who am I going to start with? Maybe Chris?
Sure, I'm more interested to hear from my panelists and myself on this. I would just say my little area where I think we really need innovation is in the civic tech area. I mean, and also the non-tech ways of having better democratic and political communications. But we do see some other jurisdictions that just do a better job of innovating in how governments engage citizens and how citizens work together. And there are a lot of lessons to learn from Taiwan, for instance, which has a really vibrant, open governance approach, and some exciting uses of technology to help bring people into decision making in interesting ways.
Fantastic. Melissa, do you want to add to that in the innovation piece?
Sure. I think it's important for us to think about what kind of messages move people, like what they respond to, because what we've been doing so far hasn't necessarily been working. So I want to point to a study that was just published in the last year or two that surveyed over 7,500 people from 5 different countries, and they presented different climate policies and then presented them with 2 different framings for each policy. So kind of health framing and economic framing, and environmental framing versus migration framing, for example. And what they found was that when they framed those policy proposals in terms of health, that across every single audience, so including those people who weren't concerned about climate change, that was what moved people the most to support those climate policies. So try to think about human health and well-being when conveying your messages. The second interesting finding was that when they used opportunity framing, so these are all the positive things that will happen when this climate policy happens, versus threat framing, meaning these are all the awful things that will happen if we don't, that was far more motivating for people to support that policy proposal. So I think it's important to think about framing our messages in a way that will be the most palatable and move the most people. And then second of all, I think it's just important to get the messages out there. So in addition, to working with CAPE and the BC Parks Foundation, I'm also, I've been working in the media for almost 15 years actually as a medical expert on the CBC, and currently a climate panelist on Early Edition and resident climate columnist on CBC TV Vancouver. And it's really important for us to think about not just generating this information, but also getting it out there. So making sure that as entrepreneurs that we, from the beginning, think about the story that we want to tell and the ways that we can tell that story in a compelling way, and making friends with journalists, making friends with media, so that when the time comes for you to share your amazing work, that more people know about it. Because if people don't know about it, they're not going to be inspired, and they're not going to want to amplify and replicate. So I think those are 2 important things: the framing, and also just getting your message out there and thinking about the story you want to tell from the beginning.
I love it. Okay, and Christine, do you have something about innovation?
Yeah, absolutely. And echo that framing piece in particular. One of the challenges I see, again, from my work in local government is that we really need help making the solutions that exist viable and to some degree kind of palatable for people. So a lot of the local government tools that we have for reducing carbon emissions are difficult to bring in. And I'm going to go right to parking, which I will tell you I wouldn't have known 7 or 8 years ago was as difficult a topic as it is to move the needle on. When we look at that 40% of carbon pollution that comes from transportation, a big part of it is shifting people out of reliance on private vehicles, so 2 of the key solutions that the City of Vancouver's Climate Emergency Action Plan included were about parking permits across the city, and parking permits that had a kind of climate levy so that new gas vehicles would pay more than electric vehicles or older vehicles. It was an attempt to kind of overlay climate and equity together in public policy, and also to create some revenue that could fund the types of investments in safe streets and active transportation that we know we need at scale. And it was incredibly difficult to talk about publicly, partly to go back to our earlier conversation because of huge amounts of intentional misinformation that were circulated about it, and also because it is a very unsexy topic and people just don't want to pay for parking. And so solutions like that, I'm going to put mobility pricing in the same category, good public policy that is hard to sell to the public. And so I recognize, you know, we can have the smartest of public policy folks coming up with these solutions, but there's a lot that there's a big gap still where we need help making those solutions viable to the general public and getting people on board with them. I also think there's a lot of help needed, innovation needed in terms of making the solutions that exist fair and equitable for everyone. And so I will go back to building retrofits. You know we need to get existing buildings off gas, but I sometimes hear from tenants who will tell me how hot their unbearably, almost unlivably hot their building gets during heat events in Vancouver, and also how nervous they are that if their building were to get retrofitted and updated, that their rent would go up beyond what they can afford, or that they would be displaced. And so they would rather it be ignored. They would rather not see a change because that housing instability is such a real concern for folks. And so again, where the technical solutions exist, there's still a lot of work for us to be doing in making sure they are just and fair and building that public support so that we can go as fast as we need to go given the climate science. And I see a huge need there for folks across all sorts of sectors to step in and help making sure that the technical solutions that we have, and we really do, I am of the belief that that we're not lacking in technical solutions to the climate challenge. Our gaps are really political and social, to some degree economic, but it's really about how we tackle these problems at scale and bring the public along and make sure that nobody is left behind, because that social solidarity piece is actually how we get everyone on board to act as quickly as we need to. And the last thing I'll just say is that I also really believe that we need leadership and innovation across every sector. I'm not a healthcare expert, but I am lucky to get to hear from so many folks in that field about the work that is happening and the work that needs to happen. And we need that in every place to get where we need to go together.
Fantastic. So we've got some questions up on this fancy Slido thing on the screen. I don't know if you guys can see them. So I'm going to read the first one, and we'll just see if any or all of you want to answer it or comment on it. So Vancouver Economic Development Commission, or Vancouver Economic Commission, sorry, was recently announced as being folded into Vancouver's city manager's office. How will this impact Vancouver's innovation and investor attraction activities? So I don't know if the question is specifically on the health sustainability, so I'll just let you sort of interpret as you like there, if anyone would like to answer that.
I can say a bit about that. And I will start by saying I'm actually unfortunately limited in what I can say because it was a council decision in a closed meeting. But I'm really concerned about the VEC being shut down and the gaps that will be created. The Vancouver Economic Commission for many, many years has been an important partner in the community. And I'm sure there are folks in the room who have worked with or had touch points with VEC in one way or another. And in particular, one of the things I most appreciated about VEC was its focus on clean tech, green jobs, and growing the green economy, which is part of Vancouver's brand. It's one of Vancouver's strengths in terms of jobs and innovation, and the plan to eliminate the VC and then bring a few of those functions into an in-house business model is what that new thing is still vague and up in the air. So I think that's an opportunity for folks who think that work is important to make their voices heard to council and make sure that those important pieces continue to be prioritized in whatever the new model is that this council creates, that we continue to support small local businesses, and also that we continue to support those climate innovators, so many of whom have been nurtured and grown up in Vancouver and then had impact far beyond the city of Vancouver.
Thank you. And Chris and Melissa, do either of you have anything to contribute to that question? Or do you want me to know? Okay, it doesn't look like you're jumping up. And we've got lots of questions. So, okay. So I think this is a great question, this next one. So it's all well and good for a large, well-financed city to work on this. What can smaller municipalities, and there's a call out specifically to Hazelton, do to make a difference in this area? Does anyone have thoughts on that?
I might just answer first. I'm sure Chris and Christine, you have thoughts. Hazelton was where I worked. That was where my first job was after I graduated from residency on the traditional and unceded territories of the Gitxsan and Wet'suwet'en. And so I think something really important, for example, with Hazelton and other smaller places, is to start to bring in your local resources, like traditional knowledge from Indigenous peoples on how to make peace with nature, make peace with the land, and be sustainable at the same time. And then I think in smaller communities too, there's this huge sense of community, like almost everyone knows everyone else. And I think we shouldn't underestimate the influence of influencers, for example. So when we lived in Hazelton, we actually bought the first hybrid vehicle in the Hazeltons ever. This was 2007 or 8, I think, before anyone did. We ended up moving back to Toronto, but that was the first one. There's evidence also showing that, for example, when neighbors start putting up solar panels, that other people start to follow suit, like it's kind of catching. So I think, even if the first step is a small one, I think if individual people and people getting together in their smaller groups start to make change locally, that can scale up and amplify, also informed by knowledge of local peoples who have that connection to the land and sustainability.
Wow, that worked out well. I feel like that could have been a plant, but I don't know. Okay, no, I don't think so. So I've got another one here. How is the city of Vancouver encouraging innovation? Where can innovators and entrepreneurs plug into bringing their ideas or solutions to the city? Anyone have?
I can give a little bit of an answer, at least to start that one off. We have such an incredible wealth of innovation in the city. And one of the projects I have gotten to overlap with a number of times is, oh my goodness, now my brain is going to blank on, okay, I'm blanking on the name, but the effort, the city is a partner. Oh my goodness, this is so embarrassing. The city is a partner with a number of local colleges and universities to support students in doing community engaged projects, on the ground projects, a number of which, is it City Hive? Oh, sorry. A number of which become part of City of Vancouver projects and policies more broadly, and I have gotten to go each year to their presentations and hear about these student projects, and I really appreciate that lifting up of young voices, but also so much that the city has to learn from folks living across Vancouver, often renters, often folks who are taking public transit, who are seeing the city at a real ground level day to day, and that those experiences and the ideas that they have for making Vancouver better can feed into our decision making, I think is a really important structural model. And the name of it's going to come to me in like an hour. But things like that. And I'll say on the business side, there's been work over the last couple of decades and a lot of work still ahead in how we make Vancouver an easier place to do business, particularly supporting our many small local businesses that add character to neighborhoods across the city. And that's been a focus for me, working with BIAs and working with the city to support all of those small shops and public spaces in neighborhoods across the city.
And somebody, I knew it, I absolutely knew it. Somebody's provided us on Slido with the name. Is it City Studio?
Yes, exactly. Thank
fantastic.
you. If I was in the room, I knew somebody could just shout it at me. City Studio.
And
yeah.
Fantastic. And I'm actually just going to sneak a little piece in here because when we talk about entrepreneurs, I think, you know, often, at least me, the sort of first thing that comes to mind is folks starting little private companies. And actually an enormous amount of Vancouver's legacy around innovation has come out of other sectors like the cooperative sector. So I'm just going to slide that in subtly. Okay, on to the next question.
Can I make another
yes.
plug? There's a hub, a social enterprise hub that I am such a fan of that I just want to name too, called Flavors of Hope, which is a sort of small scale social enterprise for immigrant women who cook, who create small scale catering companies. And they all have websites online. The Flavors of Hope project helps connect them to kitchen space and then the resources to promote their work and mostly hiring other immigrant women from their communities. Another example, I think, of not just big business, but really creative community building, and in this case through food, which is just another love of mine.
Fantastic. Okay, so I'm just looking at the time. Okay, maybe we can get one more question. So hypothetically, if we had to focus on only one narrow segment of our population to make the biggest difference, which segment is that, and how can we activate them? And actually, we only have two more questions. So maybe what I'll do is I'll throw them all out, and then I'll let you each close with either a call to action, an answer to one of the questions, sort of summary. Okay, so the next question, how to solve the problem between huge capital investment decisions and sustainable development? How better to answer the return on investment question? And somehow the other question has disappeared, I think. So I'm going to leave it to each of you. So maybe I'll start with Melissa. Do you have sort of one final, whether it's an answer, a thought, a call to action to leave us with?
Sure. You know what my answer is on, it's not that narrow a segment of the population, but I'm going to say mothers. So I'm a mother myself. It was becoming a mother that really activated my interest in action on climate change. And moms have done incredible work on creating social change. They helped enact the smoking ban in the US that spread to Canada. They helped enact bans on drunk driving. There's so many examples of parents, mothers, who have, out of concern for their children and out of concern for their children's future, activated. And there's nothing, you know, many of us have this experience. There's nothing like a mom who wants to protect their child in terms of a force to be reckoned with. So that would be one thing. And then in terms of what I want to leave you with in terms of action, I would just say get outside. I know, you know, we're inside, we are all inside these buildings right now. It's probably a windowless room that you all have been hanging out in all day. But, you know, this climate work, it's both a sprint and it's a marathon. And we need to be as resilient and healthy as we can be so that we can continue to engage in this work. So, you know, so spend at least 2 hours outside each week, at least 20 minutes each time, and get your friends and family to do it as well. Thanks.
Fantastic. Chris, do you have something you want to leave us with?
Yeah, well, just in terms of a sector, again, it's maybe not one, it's one that we would normally think would play a big part in innovation. And certainly something that I'm worried about and see a lot of my students as they come to the end of undergraduate and graduate degrees is this really difficult question, where can I live? can I stay in Vancouver and contribute to this innovation? And, this is not, we are all aware of the housing crisis, but I think, it's also for Vancouver an innovation risk. And I think yet another reason why we need to really be innovative and determined in addressing those sorts of issues. And then for an action going forward, I'm going off brand and not talking about tech or politics, but I've been reading this lovely book called Orwell's Roses by Rebecca Solnit recently. And she quotes the author, George Orwell, saying something like, the greatest thing you can do for posterity is to plant a tree, preferably one of the long-living ones, or a rose bush, as the book's title suggests. So maybe in addition to going out and enjoying the outdoors, as Melissa recommended, something you can do out there is think about planting something for future generations.
And Christine, do you have something you can leave us with?
Sure, happy to. And I also just want to say, I just was able to pull up the Slido myself, and I see someone popped in a report on responding to climate misinformation. I have found it already and look forward to reading it. So thank you to whoever popped that in.
Oh, that was me.
Was that? There you go.
Yeah.
I'm going to answer this question in two ways. And one is, this, of course, comes from the local government work that I do as well. But I really do think that we need more people making their voices heard to decision makers. And so would encourage people to reach out to your city councillors, to your MLAs and your MPs, and make sure that they know that climate is a priority for you, and a nudge that our democracy doesn't just happen during elections, but in all of those ways, creating, sending emails, making phone calls, requesting meetings. I'll say, again, from my experience, that I know locally elected leaders tend to be, as Chris said earlier, quite accessible. So requesting a meeting to talk about climate issues is an important way to make sure that they know that this is a priority for you. But I'm going to go a little bit further and say also that we need more people to run for office for whom this is a priority, so that those decision-making tables are full of people who feel the urgency to act on climate. And so I would encourage folks as well to get involved as volunteers on campaigns, get involved in elections, and consider running yourself one day, particularly if you don't see yourself represented around decision-making tables right now. Encourage you to consider running. And then on the kind of other end of the spectrum from that, I also think it's important that we have more real conversations about these issues with one another in your workplace, in your union, at your family Thanksgiving table, whatever that looks like. As Melissa said earlier, talking about Hazelton, these sorts of things really do catch on. And so it matters when people hear from someone they trust, hear from someone they love, about the urgency that they feel on these issues. And that's an important catalyst. That means so much more than hearing something on the news or hearing something from a politician like me. Those personal connections mean a lot in getting other people to care and to move toward action. You can invite them along with you to send a letter or come to a rally or a meeting, but that really starts with having meaningful connections and conversations with one another. And one of the concerns that I have and that I see out there these days is how disconnected and segmented we're becoming. And so those conversations feel more important than ever, and keeping us connected to one another across whatever difference, so that the solutions that we're advocating for and hopefully that we bring into place really do benefit all of us, and that we're moving in that direction together.
Wow. Okay. honestly, the three of you have not only given us so much insight into the connection between sustainability and health, but managed to weave in just a staggering breadth of other key issues that play into moving this work forward. So I just want to say on behalf of everyone in the room, thank you so much. And can I turn the mic to you, Michelle? Yeah.